Adelia.
So how many of you were here last year, actually, and heard part of this presentation? You're still going to hear some components of it. The challenge that we had last year is that there was still a lot of this in flux because the FDA was kind of finalizing some of these rules, and so I couldn't make some definite statements to some things, but this year there's a little bit more clarity to it. The problem is that there's still a lot of questions as people begin to pose questions that we don't have answers to yet. And the fact of the matter is we're probably not going to have all the answers even up until the time that we start getting into these changes that we're going to talk about. So the FDA continually comes out with new guidance when these questions come up, and so once again, we'll probably even have those types of questions being answered after these rule changes or these antibiotic label changes go into effect. So essentially what I'm going to do this evening is, first of all, people like to understand why these changes are occurring in the first place. So I'm going to take some time and walk through the reasons as to why that is. And then we'll specify exactly what these changes are going to look like. And then I'm going to kind of give you some things to think about in being prepared for these changes before they get here at the end of this year. Now, one thing I've been doing over the last year, as I've done so many of these meetings, is I have began to get, what I understand to be common questions from producers. And so at the very end, I've also got that list of questions. And so we'll walk through those each. You may have additional questions, and we'll kind of take care of those at that point in time. So here's why the changes are occurring. Now, when you, I don't know exactly what you follow in terms of media out there regarding issues in the livestock industry, but one of those topics that's been really popular, at least within the last 10 years, is related to concerns with antibiotic use in the livestock industry. So there's two ways that concern is being talked about. One is through what we call antibiotic residues, and the other one is through the creation of antibiotic-resistant organisms through our use of antibiotics in the livestock industry. Now, when it comes to the consumer, my impression is that most consumers, because of the difficulty in understanding antibiotic resistance, what they default to is just concern over antibiotic residues. And that would make sense from the standpoint that they don't want antibiotic residues in their food supply, you don't want them, I don't want them. So what kind of data do we have out there in the internet to give us an indication as to whether there is residue problem or not? So most people aren't aware of this, but in the mid-60s, USDA put in place what is called the Antibiotic Residue Monitoring System. And so this is carried out by the Food Safety Inspection Service, and essentially there's two components to that system. One is what they call scheduled sampling, and the other one is what they call inspector-generated sampling. Now with scheduled sampling, essentially what happens is some statisticians in DC, they calculate every year how many animals need to be randomly sampled from the livestock industry or at the packing plants to give them roughly a 95% confidence interval of what level of residues that we do have in the meat supply. And so they get their marching orders from DC, and so these food safety inspectors, they began taking samples from animals that have passed ante-mortem inspection. Now, the FDA does publish, or the USDA does publish this data, but it always lags about 3 years behind the current point in time, and it comes out in a document called the FSIS Red Book. So you can look this document up on the internet if you're interested in it. But as I went through the Red Book from 2012, which is the most current information that we have, in that year they sampled approximately 5,400 animals, and what they found is out of those 5,400, only 12 of them have violative residues. Okay, so that's 0.02% of that population, which I think we can all admit is relatively low, right? Now, the fact of the matter is we are producing food for the American public, and so that value needs to be zero. But in the grand scheme of things, that's pretty low. Now, the other component of this that we talked about was those inspector-generated samples. And so what happens in that situation is up on that inspection from that USDA individual, if they see an animal has any one of these active lesions, or instead an animal that is coming in from a person that was a previous violator, or that animal has an injection site lesion on its neck, or somewhere on its body, by the letter of the law, those inspectors are required to take a tissue sample from that animal, submit it, and test for violative residues. So that makes sense, right? From the standpoint that those are the animals that are going to be high. So if you're a betting person, if you were going to suspect which animals would have a violative residue, that would be them, right? Okay, so it's a high-risk population. So what does that look like? So in 2012, once again, approximately 215,000 samples taken, and they had roughly double the amount of violative residues. So once again, even in these high-risk animals, residues are not that big of a problem. And once again, these, nor those animals before them, ever entered the food supply because of that residue violation. So really, when we talk about the reason why these antibiotic label changes are being made, it's not because of antibiotic residues, because as you've seen, that is not really the issue. But it's instead related to, if we're using antibiotics in the livestock industry, could we be creating an antibiotic-resistant organism that contaminates the meat supply or gets shed into the environment, and now people become infected with that organism, need treatment, but the antibiotics the medical doctors are prescribing aren't effective because that's an antibiotic-resistant bug that we create in the livestock industry. And this is the theory that academics, scientists, politicians are debating every day. Is this a fact? Is this a bunch of hogwash? What's the take on this? So I'll tell you what my take on this is, and I followed this subject to the best of my ability. I've talked to people much smarter about this whole antibiotic resistance issue than what I am. And probably the person that has summed up this whole issue the best is Mike Apley, who's a veterinary pharmacologist at K-State. And what he'll say is that to say that we have no impact on antibiotic resistance in the human population through our use of antibiotics in the livestock industry, that's probably irresponsible. But at the same rate, to say we have a significant impact is irresponsible as well. But nonetheless, it's based upon this theory right here, and they do it under what is called the precautionary principle. And that precautionary principle basically says is that we don't have conclusive evidence to say that something may create a problem, but because that problem could be so significant, we're going to put measures in place to prevent it from ever happening in the first place. And so this is a way a lot of policy decisions are being made. They went through antibiotic change in the European Union in the late 90s based upon this very same concept right here. And that's what's driving the changes that we're getting ready to talk about here in the U.S. Okay, so I'm going to walk real quickly through 3 guides for industry documents that were released over a 10-year period. The reason why I'm going to go through these is just more or less explains what these changes are going to look like. And so when we get through those, then I'll summarize what those changes are going to be. So the first document that came out was GFI 152, and that document was finalized in 2003. That part in italics is the title of that document. And what's important about that document tonight is that in the appendix of 152, the FDA provided a list of antibiotics that they consider to be medically important in human medicine. Okay, and so it's these antibiotics that are listed in 152 that are going to be impacted by these antibiotic label changes we're going to talk about. So if you're curious about what some of those are, here they are. So it's penicillins, tetracyclines, macrolides, lincosamines, the list goes on, and this is only a partial list. Okay, so it's those compounds that are going to be impacted by these changes. Now, one important point I need to make is that you see at the bottom there it says what is not listed in 152 are the ionophores, because that's a big compound that we use in beef cattle specifically. So you all know what an ionophore is? It's the rumensin type products. Now technically it is considered to be an antimicrobial, but the FDA does not consider it to have any medical importance in humans, therefore it will not be impacted by these changes. And you'll see me re-emphasize that again just so that it sticks. Okay, so rumensin is not going to be impacted by these changes, nor are some of those other compounds down there that most of us don't know what the heck they are anyhow. But it's those there up at the top, especially the chlorotetracycline as well as the oxytetracycline, that is going to have the biggest impact on the cattle producers. Okay, second document that came out is GFI 209, and what that specifically addressed was the use of antibiotics in food animals for production purposes. And production purposes include growth promotion and feed efficiency. So I'll skip past this slide just for time's sake, but moving on, there was two important principles that the FDA put in GFI 209. And it was these two principles that they wanted the animal health industry to move forward with. So the first principle was, and these are verbatim, and that is the use of medically important antimicrobial drugs in food-producing animals should be limited to those uses that are necessary for assuring animal health. And so there's two things that are implied by that statement. The first one is that antibiotics are labeled for use in four ways. One is treatment of disease, prevention of disease, control of disease, and then production purposes. Once again, growth, promotion, feed efficiency. And what the FDA is saying in that first principle there is that, okay, livestock industry, we're okay with you using these medically important antimicrobials or antibiotics for treatment, prevention, and control of disease, but we think those production indications should no longer be on the label. The other thing that is implied by this statement is that the antibiotics that have those production claims on them are only those that are administered through the feed and water. So just in that first principle there alone, we learned back in 2012 that the FDA was targeting feed grade and water-soluble antibiotics. Now, most producers that I know that use feed grade and water-soluble antibiotics don't use them for production purposes. So that first principle doesn't necessarily have an impact, but that second principle does. And what they're saying here is that essentially those medically important antimicrobials now should be moved from over-the-counter availability to veterinary oversight only. All right, so we'll come back to that once again and summarize it here in just a little bit. So the final GFI document that came out was 213. This one was finalized in December of 2013, and that date is important. I'll show you why that is in just a moment. Basically what they'll tell you about 209 is that's what the FDA wanted the animal health industry to do. And so when they proposed that to the animal health industry, all the manufacturers of those feed grade and water soluble antibiotics wrote a letter to the FDA and said, we will comply with those two principles that you recommended in 209. And so then the FDA came out with 213, which basically outlined the process that these companies would go through to get their labels changed to comply with those two recommendations. So a couple of things that came out of 213. First of all, FDA described what a medically important antibiotic was. Once again, that is those that are listed in 152. They also described the process for voluntarily phasing out production claims on the label. And they also phased in that requirement for veterinary oversight with these products if they were going to be used in an operation. And the final thing is, in 213, they also provided a timeline in which these changes were to occur. And essentially, it was to be 3 years from the final date of publication of 213, so you do the math on that. And that puts us on the timeline that at the end of the year, these changes will go into effect, and then this all goes live January 1st, 2017. Okay, so let's summarize this. That's a lot of information. Let's boil it down. First change, as we've already alluded to, if an antibiotic, feed grade and water soluble, and it's medically important, has a production claim on it, that production claim is going to be removed from the label. So when you scan the feed grade antibiotics that we have available for use in beef cattle, this is the main ones right here, and those have indications for growth promotion and feed efficiency on them, or on those products somewhere on the label. So those claims are going to come off that label, and at the beginning of next year, it will no longer be permissible to use them for growth promotion and feed efficiency. Now, if those products have indications for other things, such as treatment, prevention, or control of disease, they will still be on the market for those purposes. So all those products do have other indications other than growth promotion, feed efficiency. All right, the second component of these changes is that if it is a feed grade antibiotic starting January 1st, 2017, that you're wanting to use in your operation, and it's in that list of 152, it is going to require what is called a veterinary feed directive from your veterinarian for you to get that product from a feed distributor and use it in your operation. And if it's a water-soluble antibiotic, essentially what that means is you will need a prescription. Now people will go, well, what is the difference between a VFD and a prescription? Well, they both require veterinary oversight, but a prescription, what happens when a product has that tag on it, or is a prescription product, that basically invokes state pharmacy laws. And so people that handle that product need to have or comply with state pharmacy regulations. And so when you think about how we use most of our antibiotics in the industry, it's feed-grade antibiotics, not water-solubles. And so in order to address that situation and not invoke state pharmacy laws, back in the mid-90s, the FDA created a drug class called a VFD, or a veterinary feed directive drug. And so what this allowed them to do is put some of these medications under veterinary oversight, but that did not invoke state pharmacy laws. And so by keeping it like your aureomycin or your chlorotetracycline that you would use in a feed, by making it a VFD drug, this means that your feed distributors will still be able to handle that product without having to worry about state pharmacy regulations. Okay, but they still both, whether a prescription or a VFD, do require veterinary oversight. Okay, so here's some important points, things to think about. First of all, once again re-emphasizing, these changes do not apply to the ionophores, such as Rumensin, doesn't affect Bovatec, Decox, or Corin. So a lot of those we use for coccidiostats. The other component of this is that, and this even applies now, if your veterinarian is issuing you a prescription for a drug or dispensing you an antibiotic such as Draxxin, Micatil, Baytril, Nuflor, whatever the case may be, those are prescription drugs. You and your veterinarian have in place what is called a veterinary client-patient relationship so that they can do that. And basically what that means is that your veterinarian has a working relationship with you, as well as has knowledge of your operation. Same thing applies. In order for a veterinarian to write a VFD, they also have to have this VCPR in place. Now, if you're curious as to what a VCPR is, here's the definition of it. And if you take the time to read through that, you'll be just as confused as I am. So here's what I'll say about this. The veterinarians in this state will be using our definition of a VCPR in order for them to write you these VFDs and continue issuing you prescriptions like they always have in the past. It's not your problem to worry about the definition of what a VCPR is. Your responsibility is just to make sure that you get in contact with a veterinarian before this all goes live and make sure that you have that in place. So once again, for those of you who use a veterinarian quite often, you ought to feel pretty comfortable with that, and you do probably have a VCPR in place. The people that are going to have the challenge with this are those producers that just use a veterinarian once in a blue moon, okay, that don't have a veterinarian come out and do herd work in the spring and fall or whatever the case, preg cows. And so in that case, you're going to have to get this relationship established with the veterinarian, and there's going to be some agreement or some judgment that this veterinarian is going to have to make at how often they're going to have to visit your operation to comply with the definition of a VCPR. Now that recently seen term, right there kind of in the, 2/3 of the way down that definition, that's the one that causes a lot of concern, not only in producers, but also in veterinarians. And that is, what does that mean? Now there's some states that actually say specifically that recently seen means that, among a lot of other things on here, the veterinarian has to step foot on the operation at least once a year. And our licensing board here in Missouri has also kind of come down on that, even though that they haven't specified that. Their interpretation would be that it needs to be at least within the last year amongst all these other things. Okay, so keep that in mind if you don't use a veterinarian very often. Here's a biggie, and that is not now, nor not when all these changes go into effect, has extra label drug use of feed additives been or will be legal. And so extra label drug use is essentially using a drug at a dose by a route for an indication or in a species that is not on the label of that product. Here's my point, and that is I know a lot of people in this state use chlorotetracycline, aureomycin, whatever you want to call it, for treatment, prevention, or control of pink eye in the summertime. And when you look at the indications of what aureomycin is permitted to be used for, according to the label, it is those 3 items right there. So here's what I want to let you in on. When this all goes live and you have to go into your veterinarian, if you've been using chlorotetracycline in the past for control of pink eye, don't put them in a position where you're asking them to write you a VFD for the use of CTC for control of pink eye, because they can't do it. That's illegal use, it's extra label drug use, and as we have already established, using these feed additives or feed antibiotics in a way that they are not labeled is not permissible, not now, nor will it be in the future. Now, I will also say that if your veterinarian was to write extra label drug use on a VFD, a copy is going to have to go to the feed distributor. And when the feed distributor gets that copy, they're going to review it very closely because their rear end's on the line if they were to fill an illegal order. Okay, so if they were to see for control of pink eye on that VFD for aureomycin or chlorotet, they're going to kick it back to the veterinarian and say, we can't fill this, that's an illegal order. Okay, those guys are the ones that are going to be audited most often. One of the questions I have at the end is who's responsible for policing this? And the fact of the matter is, FDA doesn't have the money nor the staff to do it. So like they've done with a lot of other federal type regulations, what they normally do will contract with states. And so probably here in Missouri, they'll contract with Missouri Department of Ag Feed Division. And so the feed inspectors, as they do their inspections of the mill, will also be responsible for the component of inspecting these VFDs and making sure all those regulations are met as well. So the feed distributors are not going to play loose and fast with this whatsoever, because once again, they're the ones that are going to be the target of the inspections in most cases, and they're not going to want to get in trouble over that. Okay, so we get some questions about what's the expiration date of these VFDs, because the FDA requires that information. Basically, most of these compounds, chlorotet et al., that's over the counter currently and moving to VFD drug status at the end of this year, they do not have a VFD expiration date specified on the label. And we do not expect that that date will be specified either. And so what the FDA has said regarding that is that if that is the case and it's not specified, then the maximum expiration date is 6 months from the date of issuance. So essentially what that means is that if you're using something like CTC year-round, you would have to get that VFD order refilled or renewed every 6 months. When the veterinarian writes a VFD for you, they're going to do 3 copies. If they do this electronically, one of those copies, the electronic copy, they're going to have to send it to the feed mill directly and not to you first. You will get your copy electronically, but they've also got to send a copy to the feed mill. The other approach that they can take is issue this in hard copy, and in that situation, it is okay for them to give you both of those hard copies, and then you take one of those copies to the feed mill and give it to them so that they can fill that order. Now, whether it's the veterinarian, the feed mill, or yourself, everybody needs to keep a copy of that document on file for 2 years from the date of issuance. Now, because it is a federal document, that means theoretically that you are at risk of being audited. And so what the FDA will say is that you do have to produce these documents if by chance you were ever audited. Now, that brings up the question that everybody has, what's my odds of being audited? And I don't think we can predict that at this point. Obviously, the feed mills, they're the ones that are going to be audited most often. I expect the only time that a veterinarian and a producer would be audited if there's something awry in the system, there's a violative residue that has occurred in a packing plant, or there's been orders that have been filled at a feed distributor that were illegal type orders, that might be the only time in which the veterinarian and the producer might be audited in that situation. But you still need to have these copies just in case that happens. Okay, so here's some information that you will need to provide to your veterinarian when they fill out this VFD. First of all, production class of animals, which they'll pretty much know that when they're writing this as they go to look up the dose in which they're going to prescribe it for. The approximate number of animals that are going to be fed on this VFD order prior to the expiration date. So if you think about a cow-calf operation and you're writing a VFD for control of anaplasmosis, which is legal use, let's say you're just going to 100 head of cows in your herd, that would be the number that you give the veterinarian, or round up, round down a few. Probably wouldn't shortchange yourself. Where that number is going to be the hardest for people is that if you have a high throughput stalker or backgrounder operation and you got cattle moving through there, you know, a 45-day turnover in a 6-month period, that may take a little more effort to calculate what that number is going to be, but that's a piece of information that veterinarian is going to need to know. Location of the animals. The reason why I put this one on here is that at the top of these VFD orders, it's going to have your name, your address, telephone number, as well as the veterinarian's name, address, and telephone number. And if the animals are located at that address that's up at the top of the document, nothing else is required in that slot. However, I know a lot of you have animals scattered here and yon that may not be at your resident location. And so because of that, what the FDA requires that the veterinarian do is specify that location that those animals are at if it's not the home address that is at the top of that page. So keep that in mind. Here's another thing to pay attention to. If you plan on putting something else in that ration, another feed additive, you gotta let your veterinarian know that. Here's what I mean. So if you're putting chlorotetracycline in with some type of ionophore, your veterinarian needs to know what that ionophore is going to be. First of all, the FDA has approved combinations, and those that aren't approved are not approved to be mixed together. One of those that people will make the mistake on is chlorotetracycline, or aureomycin, once again, whatever you want to call it, and Rumensin are not approved combinations according to the FDA. So you can't put those two together, can't be feeding them at the same time. On the other hand, Bovatec and chlorotetracycline, or Decox and chlorotetracycline, are approved combinations. And your veterinarian needs to know that information when they're filling out that VFD order. Final piece of information is where are you going to get that medicated feed from, so the veterinarian can, if they're emailing that order, can email it to that feed distributor. The only thing we really have to say on this slide is number 4 there. And it's not permissible for you to give your VFD medicated feed to a neighbor that doesn't have a VFD for that stuff. Okay, so even though your neighbor may just need a little to get them by every now and then, by the letter of the law, it's not permissible for you to give them your medicated feed. They should go out and get their own VFD for that medicated feed. Common questions. This is the first one's the one I always get. I tell everybody I've done this thing 50 plus times. The first one always comes up at every meeting I've done. What's the cost of a VFD going to be to the producer? What's a veterinarian going to charge me? I don't have the answer for that. Expect a cost associated with it. I've done several veterinary meetings related to this, and nobody yet has thrown out a price yet as to what they're going to charge. And it's going to be variable, right? So if you're a producer that uses a veterinarian often, or more than just once in a blue moon, there's not probably going to be a farm call associated with a VFD that they may write, so they may just charge you for the VFD itself. But if you're an individual that just uses a veterinarian every once in a while, they may need to make a farm call to keep this VCPR going, and therefore there's going to be that additional charge associated with it. Are the veterinarians ready for this? Good question. Some are, some aren't. Probably the group that concerns me. Here's something we need to pay attention to, and it kind of goes to this deal right here. It's that last bullet point. This has so far been one of my favorite questions to use when I'm talking to groups, and I got a question from a beekeeper over in Clever, Missouri last year when I did one of these programs over there, and essentially his question was, I use water-soluble antibiotics in my beehives to prevent some disease. I don't I'm not a bee veterinarian, so I don't know what he was talking about. But nonetheless, he said, is this going to impact me? And at first blush, I thought, well, no, you're not technically, are you a livestock or food animal? But then as I thought about this, well, yeah, but, you know, you don't get, I don't think you get antibiotic residue in honey. You might. But anyhow, nonetheless. So as I thought about this, essentially what's going on, though, that you got to keep in mind is that these are label changes. So what's happening is that these labels are being affixed to these products, saying that now if it's a feed-grade antibiotic and it's medically important, it requires a VFD, or if it's a water-soluble and medically important, it requires a prescription. And so when that change is made, it doesn't matter whether you're using it in bees, rabbits, horses, whatever. That changes the dynamic of that, and those products require a prescription now because the label says so, irregardless of whether it is a food animal or not. Right? So it's just got, so the group that concerns me the most of veterinarians are the small animal veterinarians in Kansas City and St. Louis that don't know this thing's coming. Or Columbia, if we want to include them in the mix. From the standpoint, there's a lot of people out there with backyard poultry flocks, or maybe they got a few animals outside the city limits. The only veterinarian they know is their small animal veterinarian. They're going to walk into the clinic January 1 plus 2017, and those veterinarians are unprepared. Okay? So most veterinarians that work with food animals at least know this is coming and will most likely be ready when they get here. So the third bullet point there, since these are now requiring a VFD, does that mean that feed mills will only be able to order those once you give them a VFD, delaying the time in which you get that product? And the answer is no. They will still be able to keep these in inventory, but they won't be able to let them out the door till you issue a VFD. Will injectable tetracyclines or penicillins be affected by these changes? Not these changes specifically, but prepare for yourself that probably within the next 2 to 5 years, so I'm told, that we'll see injectable penicillins, tetracyclines that you can currently pick up at your farm store without a veterinary prescription. Those will probably go from OTC availability to veterinary prescription only. If you walk in the world that I do and pay attention to these antibiotic issues, that is a hot potato in Washington, D.C. and has been for a while. And so we will continue to see further antibiotic restrictions come into place over the next few years. If you want to know what's in the future for us, look at the state of California. January 1, 2018, based upon legislation they just recently passed, they kind of stepped ahead of what's going to happen to the rest of the country. Among some other things, what they're doing is they're saying, we don't care what it says, whether those products are available over the counter or not, those injectables, the LA200s and the penicillins, people are going to have to get a prescription from their veterinarian before they buy these in California. Okay, so that's kind of the direction we're probably going here in the U.S. Will this affect MGA? The answer is no. Will I be able to continue on-farm mixing with these antibiotics? And the answer is yes. But you still will need a VFD to get that antibiotic from that feed distributor so that you can do that on-farm mixing. And we've already talked about the last one there, at least at the state level, who's going to be responsible for policing that. Final thoughts, okay? And I've told this to every group, this just kind of helps me try to get my head around all what's coming. This is, at least in my lifetime, this may be one of the more significant changes that we as a veterinary profession and even as livestock producers go through. Probably 5 years from now, once we've gone through the growing pains, we'll look back and it'll just be another blip on the radar. We're a resilient bunch. We've gone through stuff like this before. But here's the point. And I know this data is a little bit old, but it fascinates me from the standpoint that 96% of the antibiotics that we use in the livestock industry are administered through the feed and water. Would you ever reckon that? That's a huge amount. I would have, most of the time I dispensed antibiotics or had any involvement in antibiotic choices on a livestock operation, it was the injectable. Boy, was I wrong, right? So the important point is there in bullet point 2 and 3, and that is that of that 96%, 61% of them are now considered medically important by the FDA. The lion's share of that 61% is going to be the chlorotetracyclines. Even more important, 98% of those 61% are currently available over the counter and will move to VFD drug status or prescription status at the end of this year. So with that, we're going to go through some changes. We don't have all the answers. We may not even by the time we get to that January 1st, 2017. My recommendation is between now and then, get with your veterinarian and have discussions of how you're going to address this together as a team. Because there's a lot of people out there that don't know this is coming and just take the load off of everybody. If we have these discussions now, those that are aware, that'll allow those people that aren't aware the opportunity to kind of get a place in line after this all goes into effect. Okay, so once again, it's going to be a significant change. We'll get through it. But in the meantime, have a conversation with your veterinarian if this is going to impact you in some way. Very good. Any questions? Yes, sir. Imported meat is, it goes through the antibiotic residue monitoring program as well. What's interesting about imported meat is that when you look at the FSIS Red Book, there are no violative residues that ever show up, at least in the last few years that I've looked. So, does this mean that the U.S. is only going to import beef or meat products from countries that follow these same principles? I don't have the answer to that. I don't know if they have control over that. I guess they could. I know that the European Union did this same thing 20 years ago. And it was the pork industry in Denmark that most people looked and saw what happened as a result of those changes. But just the whole European Union as a whole went through these antibiotic type changes that we're discussing tonight. And another question? Yes, sir. Very good. So the industry, or the country in the industry that has been looked at the most is Denmark. And they've got evidently a large hog population. And so when they eliminated growth promotion feed efficiency indications, what they saw is they saw a 25% increase in illness in the swine industry, and it increased the amount of use of injectable antibiotics. Some will say that, you know, one reason why the FDA gets concerned about growth promotion feed efficiency levels is those are fairly low levels of antibiotics over a continual period. And they think that may be a factor in promoting resistance. But other people that study this issue will say, you want to drive resistance, you pull out the big antibiotics and you start giving that to animals. And now what you got left, because resistance is not an all or none proposition, so you'll get mixes of populations. And what can happen is if you start pulling out the big guns of antibiotics, you're killing off the weakest and leaving only the most resilient bugs out there to breed and multiply, so to speak. So back to the Denmark deal. What was interesting is even though they saw production drop, disease increase for the first 10 years, as they continued to track that, what they saw happen is all of a sudden disease started to decrease and production started to rise. Guess why? Or why do they speculate that occurred? Well, yeah, in a roundabout way it was. What happened is the people, they speculate that were using the antibiotics as a Band-Aid, it drove them out of business. And the managers, the good managers, were able to adjust to those changes and continue on. So it kind of skewed the population then that was being viewed as, you know, here's our producers in this country. That is an important thing to keep in mind though, folks. Will it be that drastic here in the U.S.? I've had other producer groups say, is this going to drive some of the poorer managers out of business, whether it's in the beef cattle industry or whatever the case may be? I don't know. But if we look at Denmark, that is a possibility. Now the key thing of that Denmark, and I don't mean to go on and on, but the key thing in the Denmark deal but they also saw this is all about human health, right? It didn't really change the picture there, and they continue to see antibiotic resistance rise. Here in the U.S., we eliminated an antibiotic known as enrofloxacin, which is basically Baytril 100 for chickens. From the poultry industry, I don't know, it's 5-10 years ago, now it's 5 years ago, under the premise that use of enrofloxacin in poultry was creating antibiotic-resistant Campylobacter species in humans. When they withdrew enrofloxacin from the poultry industry, did not change Campylobacter resistance in humans, and it continued to rise. That's information the CDC doesn't like to talk about. Point is, this whole antibiotic, just to say it's simple as using antibiotics in livestock creates antibiotic-resistant superbugs, which have a negative impact on human health. The more you know about this issue, the more complicated it becomes. So I'll end there because I saw one more question somewhere over here. I don't know if Eldon's waving me off stage yet, but is there another question somewhere over here? Okay, very good. Yes, sir. You can do it either way. It sounds to me like you will need to have that, however, because chances are your one veterinarian's not going to want to travel to the other location. So here's how I would handle that, just like you described. Probably once or twice a year visit, and this is a discussion to have between you and your veterinarian. Is that going to be sufficient for that individual that if you request a VFD being written, that he would be willing to do that? And if not, what criteria do we need to meet to keep that going? Here's the thing about that I talk to some groups when I have more time. Just because you're issued a VFD does not mean that you have to use it. And so to avoid this so-called rush, let's say that, so we know a VFD has an expiration date of 6 months. So let's say that you're going into the fall of the year getting ready to wean calves. Instead of waiting until the last minute to go in and get that VFD from your veterinarian, if you've been using CTC in the past for pneumonia, go in a little bit early, get that VFD, have it on file with yourself, have it on file with the feed distributor, and that way if you need it, you just have them fill that order and you already got your paperwork taken care of. And if you don't need it, that's fine. That document expires, and all you've done is just waste a little time and maybe a little money if your veterinarian charges it. There may be some veterinarians out there that you're going to have variation on how they charge for this. They may say, I work on your operation, I'm out to your operation 4 to 5 times a year, you do a lot of business with me, I may just consider that being a cost of business. I'm not going to charge you for a VFD. There may be other veterinarians out there that charge it like a health certificate. Once again, I don't know. That's just, we're going to have to, it remains to be seen on that. Mm-hmm. Well, really, the veterinarians that is issuing that document, and it's not that you couldn't have so if a veterinarian's out in the field and they can't be there to write that document right there and then if you've called in an order, secretary can go ahead and write that order and veterinarian can approve it and, you know, get a signature on there is going to be an important part of it. And in the same way, if it's a veterinarian that you don't use very often in that particular clinic, same principles would apply. Yeah. All right. I thank you all. I've been on the road since Friday. I did a VFD meeting at the Arkansas State Veterinary Medical Association this weekend, both Saturday and Sunday. So since I've been in motel rooms since last Friday, I think I'm going to leave right after this. So catch me real quickly if you can before I take off, but I'm ready to see my wife and kids again. So anyhow, thank you all. Enjoyed being here tonight.